Today we're going to be tearing down this Audi B9 S4 engine to see what's inside and how it works. That's right, this is a late model 2019 Audi S4 engine. It's a 3-liter V6 turbocharged engine, and apparently it had a knocking sound coming from it, so we're going to tear it down to see just what caused it to fail. Now, taking a quick look around this engine, this one's got the turbocharger sitting on top, which is driven off the exhaust gases. That means we have the exhaust ports over here that drive it in a hot V configuration, and we have the intakes on the outside, the exhaust gases, and they're going to flow down towards the transmission side. Now around the side here we've got our 3 coil packs, but just underneath that we've got our direct injectors. You can see the tubing and this foam that's covering everything up. The valve covers themselves are made of aluminum, but they're actually part of the camshafts, as you'll see when we tear this down. Around the other side here you can see where the intake goes into the engine on the outside. Here's the direct injection fuel pump, and at the back here you'll see we've got our variable valve timing actuators, and that's because the timing chain, like all Audi engine, runs on the back of the engine. I'm going to start this tear down by removing this wiring harness, and of course I'm going to be very careful because these harnesses are worth a lot of money. This is cool. They made a little aluminum jacket with a velcro and a snap to protect the wiring and the gas line going to the pump. Alright, after about 15 minutes, I finally can take off this engine harness. This thing's got more foam than my parents' mattress. Now I can finally see the coil packs. You can imagine just doing a spark plug job in one of these. You gotta remove a lot of stuff. Now, one thing you'll notice in most late model engines is plastic. They use this because it's cheaper, lighter, and it'll get them by the warranty. The thing with plastic is it doesn't work very well with hot engines because they expand and they tend to leak. Whether it's air pipes, vacuum pipes, coolant pipes, or any other pipe that carries bodily fluid, it just doesn't work very well for the longevity of the engine. And you can see directly where the PCV system is going to bring oily air directly into the intake. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. They're putting this little jacket here as a heat shield to protect that hot turbocharger from melting and degrading this plastic. Let's pull this off. And inside of there you can see the baffle that houses this PCV contraption. There's essentially a diaphragm inside of here. Here's a little jacket that's wrapped around these engine hooks. Audi knows that they're going to be pulling this engine out before the life of the vehicle's over, so why not put engine hooks? So much so that they actually had to put 4 of them. Just going to pull off this bracket for the direct injection line. Now I can knock this fuel line free. Oh, there's pressure inside. I'm going to smell like gasoline tonight. I'm going to be high and I'm not going to want to sleep. Please don't spray on me. Ooh. Now, if you haven't figured it out already, T30s are the name of the game when it comes to small bolts on Audi engines. It's just like having a 10mm on a Japanese engine. I'm going to remove this direct injection rail that feeds these 3 injectors. There you go. Oh, there's gas. It's amazing how much gas can be stored in such a little tube. They say when you don't trust one, use double protection. So I've got 2 layers of gloves here. Hopefully the gas doesn't penetrate because I need to use these fingers tonight. Alright, so it appears that these are the direct injectors and these are some other kind of coil. So let's remove that. Yeah, this looks like it's for the cam lift system. More foam than my parents' mattress. Molded and everything to fit in all the crevices here. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and pull out these injectors. Whoa, that's nice and long and black. And on the back of the engine we have a little timing cover for the head part, and that's because the timing chain runs on the back. So I'm going to remove this variable valve timing solenoid. This here is just a little plunger, and that plunger is going to push up onto the variable valve timing actuator, which is going to fill it with oil. Alright, we got a bunch of T30s going around. I still use 10mm nuts. Alright, I'm going to pry that off. So here's where things get a little interesting. We've got our intake and exhaust variable valve timing actuators respectively driven off of this timing chain, which in turn is driven off of a gear inside of here, not directly to the crank. Here is the tensioner for it. So if you do want to do a head job on one of these, potentially you could do it as long as you lock your cams and cranks so the timing doesn't get messed up. I'm going to remove these 2 T30s to relax the chain tension. Thank you. You see, they made this bolt magnetic, so in case it drops in there, you can get it. The T30s on the outside here are not magnetic. Pop this tensioner off. Now this head is actually in 2 pieces. The top part here holds the camshaft in it. Now these look weird, but they're actually an eTorx 24mm socket. I never knew I had this socket until I researched what these are. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this. Got my daughter's old shirt here. I don't think she's going to need that soon. I'll pull this off. If you remember, that plunger is going to push in on here when actuated. That's going to redirect the fluid inside of here and therefore add it to the gear or subtract it if you want to relax timing. If you want to learn more about how variable valve timing gears work, check my video linked above. Now if you're getting this deep into the engine, I recommend replacing these. Alright, just had my second breakfast. Time to work on the intake now that the timing chain side is loose. Yeah, and here's where you can see some of the carbon starting to build up inside of here. This intake is actually very simple. It's just one big cup. There's no swirl valves or anything to promote mixing inside of here. Now coming around to the front of the engine, we have a vacuum pump, which you can see we've got the outlets here. That's going to power things like the brake booster. That's because turbocharged engines don't produce consistent enough vacuum. Whoa, there's oil. So how this works is the camshaft is going to rotate it around, and this sweeper here is going to create a low pressure zone behind here, and that's ultimately going to create vacuum, which is going to drive your brake booster. You also need vacuum to control the turbocharger's wastegate, and of course this does have to be lubricated through the camshaft. You've also got a relief valve inside of here. Next up, we've got to take out about 1500 teeth, 30 bolts. There's really no good pry points on this thing. There we go, much easier when you got all the bolts out. Taking a look inside of this valve cover, you can see that the camshafts are actually integrated, so I'd call this more of a cam cover or a cam carrier. The cam caps themselves are actually bolted upside down, and you can see we've got the intake camshaft here. It's got this unique groove inside of here. That's for those solenoids we took off earlier to provide variable valve lift. You can see this camshaft profile is lower than this one, kind of like VTEC, where it gives you more air at higher RPM. Alright, taking a look under the cover here, you can see we have a roller arm system. So essentially these rollers are what's going to act on the camshaft lobes. We have a hydraulic lifter and then of course the valve. Now this is one of the weakest points on these B9 engines. Essentially due to the bearing design, this would start to flatten out and it would cause a ticking sound. If you ignored it long enough, it'll probably completely fail and bend a valve. So here's a look at the roller arm. Now I'm not sure if this is the upgraded part, but the newer one was a lot bigger with bigger bearings inside than the older part. In order to change out something like this before it causes a lot of damage, you pretty much have to strip the engine down to at least this much, which includes the wiring harness and the cover and the timing system, plus all the other accessories that sat on top of here, including the high pressure fuel pump. It is quite a labor intensive job. Now I do have my suspicions that this has been replaced before, given the amount of RTV that was around this cover. These also do look fairly new, and I don't notice any wear on any. Just have some accessories to remove before we can get this head off here. On the front side of the engine, there's another coolant crossover pipe right next to the water pump. I'm glad this is still made of metal. Now also in the front here, we do have a crossover pipe that leads to some kind of a switch or a flow valve, which has a diaphragm inside, which is vacuum controlled. So let's take this apart and see exactly what it does. Looks like there's a bolt behind this water pump pulley. The water pump pulley feels like it's made of Chinesium. It's very lightweight, probably a die-cast metal. It's not magnetic. And the crank pulley feels the same way. For all you know, it's probably made of some kind of a plastic. Speaking of plastic, all of these idler pulleys are all made of plastic. So there you go. I don't think we're too far off before the internal combustion engine is completely made of plastic. This crossover pipe. Alright, now I can pry this valve off. So this device has a vacuum line running to it and a vacuum switching valve. So this part here is the diaphragm. I'm going to say this is a flow control valve for the coolant that runs inside of the head. I'm just going to remove some of the wiring blocking the way here. Be careful, you don't want to damage anything. Alright, so here we have the water pump housing, and attached to it we have this another plastic gizmo. I'm going to remove the vacuum switching valve. There's that contraption. Alright, now I can pull off this plastic bit here, and this is the real thermostat. And it looks like we have an electrical connector here. Now I'm going to remove the bolts holding the water pump on. Okay, this is pretty cool. So this one's got a vacuum line going to it. Now this vacuum line attaches to a vacuum switching valve at the top here, and that's going to control the flow rate of this vacuum pump mechanically. So instead of using an electric motor where you can vary the speed, this is going to vary the position of the fins relative to this part inside of here. So for example, in this position where it's stuck out the most, it's going to provide the most flow to the fluid, whereas if you stick the fins in a little bit, the fins are not really going to be touching much fluid and it won't provide much flow, which is going to allow the engine to warm up a bit faster. So that way the engine's computer can dynamically adjust how much coolant is flowing where for optimal combustion and warm-up time. and therefore efficiency and emissions. Alright, so here's my rant about the oiling system on these cars. They come with a plastic dipstick tube that goes down to the sump, but if you are to open this up here, you'll see that there is no dipstick, it's just a cap. And that's for you to attach your very expensive equipment to suck out the oil because you're lazy to jack up the car and drain it out the bottom, even though draining it out the bottom is probably the best way to get rid of any dirty particles inside of there. The oil filter is located right at the top here, so that makes it nice and simple. You don't really have to jack up the car. However, there's no dipstick tube for you to check the oil. Instead, they rely on the oil level sensor down at the bottom there to make sure you're topped up properly, but that doesn't always work. And then, because these engines do burn oil as they get older, you could run the risk of running the engine low on oil and it potentially blowing and ending up here on my engine stand as a teardown video for you guys. So if you do have one of these, make sure you go in the aftermarket and look for the proper dipstick so you can check your oil like a normal person. Alright, so let's get that dipstick off. Probably gonna break off. It actually came off in one piece. There is a head bolt on here that is a triple square M10. Then there's a hidden T30 down here. And then on the back side here, there are 3 hidden T30s. Instead of using the typical special Audi spline tool, they're using a normal M12 triple square. Well, look what we have here. Now, these pistons slightly rock in their bore, but this one rocks a lot in their bore, and you can see there's a good chunk of carbon missing from the top there, where it likely struck the head. Now I notice when this piston is near the top, it sticks a little bit proud of the face of the block here. Now the head surface looks okay. There are cross passages in between these cylinder walls here. You can see this is where they're drilled through in order to cool this wall off. They aren't using that slit that the old Ford EcoBoost engines did because that would cause an issue with holding compression between the two. This is a semi-closed block design. You've got a lot of area that's closed in here to help keep those cylinder walls in shape. This is a high-performance Audi S4 engine and people do tend to tune them, so it's got to hold a lot of power. So now that we've done the head on the driver's side, we're going to work on the head of the passenger side. It's going to be very similar with the exception of this high pressure fuel pump. Essentially we've got low pressure fuel that's going to come in through here. There's a pressure sensor and then it's going to go into this pump which is driven off of the exhaust camshaft. There is a fuel regulating valve or switch inside of here and that's going to direct fuel to split off, one that goes over to the other head and one that comes over here on the passenger side. I'm going to start by removing these connections here. Now one thing I don't like about having pumps, oh, I'm getting gas all over me. Now one thing I don't like about having direct injection pumps on the valve cover is you got to redo this whole system if you're doing a simple thing like a valve cover job, or in this engine's case a rocker arm job because they fail so much. Whew, I got gas all over the shop. And inside of there's a lobe that presses up on the spring. You've got your inputs and your outputs and your pressure sensor. Now when I buy scrap engines like this, I love these fully dressed ones so I can actually see what goes where and figure out how things work. However, it does take a lot more time for me to tear things down off camera, including all of these hoses, lines, wires and everything. But I do enjoy it because I love tearing stuff apart, especially if you don't have to put it back together. That's the crossover tube that goes over to the other head. We get the fuel rail off next. Besides a couple of 10mm bolts, I haven't whipped out my socket set for this whole teardown yet. And now I'm going to do that. Finally I have access to these bolts and I can remove this fuel rail. There's the rail. It's dripping fluid. I'm just going to pull off this foam. Probably make a nice pillow for somebody. With a lot of prying, I was able to get these out. I'm going to take out these coils for the variable lift. Here is the vacuum solenoid that controls the water pump. Oh shoot. I'll pull off this bracket. Now around the back side here on the passenger side, there's a coolant tube that leads to a hose. And you can see they made a nice little jacket for it. It's got snaps and everything. Probably an auxiliary coolant pump. That was tighter than I remember tightness being. It's amazing how tight these tolerances are on engines now. Only to learn that this is probably going to leak when this car is 5 years old anyways. Let me know if you guys want me to open this up and see what an auxiliary water pump looks like. So that clears up things for the timing side of the engine. We have this little jacket here that protected the electrical connection. There's even a heat shield around the variable valve timing solenoid. Gonna remove all the T30s holding this back timing cover on. 10 over here. They don't give you any place to pry, bro. They give you a place to hammer though. Just like your 9-year-old niece is starting to get really stubborn, these can be really hard to work on. I'm going to be removing this tensioner here. Now these tensioners are also hydraulic. You can see the oil passages that are going to flow from inside the head. So glad I don't have to get Amazon to bring me a new e-torque socket. Next up, we're going to be removing all the torques inside of here that hold this cam cover on. Pull off the cover. Once again, you can see the two different cam profiles for the variable lift system. This little lip that they put here makes it so difficult to get these out properly. Anyways, this is probably the worst one. It's got a couple of lines on it, but other than that, they do look all decent and they look similar to the other side. So not sure if this has been replaced or not. So imagine your cooling system fails and it's not due to rubber, it's due to this stupid plastic piece. How are you supposed to get a tool in behind there to get that bolt out to change this piece? Moreover, if you have to take off the intake, you do have to take off this coolant pipe anyways. I don't know how you're going to get to that bolt for the intake either. It's kind of trapped underneath there. Let's see if I can get the intake off first and then get that coolant pipe off. Can you imagine if you had to change this inside the car and take off all that stuff? Taking a look inside of this intake, you've got a big black hole over here that goes to a very gaping valley, and it's so dirty on the inside. Look at all that stuff. Yeah, all that's getting built up and sucked inside of your engine. Just like your brother-in-law, there's a couple of hidden bolts holding this head on, and a couple inside of the timing cover. And of course they had to put something different, a triple square M10 on the outside. The sheer amount of downtime I have changing tools behind camera is crazy. With a Honda, you could just tear it down with 10s, 12s, and then 14s, and they all kind of go in order. With this one, you're always switching sockets between different random ones. This is an M12 triple square for the head bolts. This little timing slide also bolts to the head. That should free up that timing slide. Now I can remove the head. I'm going to peel off this head gasket. Alright, taking a look under this head surface here, these pistons do rock a bit back and forth, but not as much as the other one on the other side. And I don't notice too many chunks of carbon missing, although the tops here do look a little clean. Next up, I'm just going to start removing some of these accessories from the block, including this coolant pipe. It's so brittle. This is where the alternator would bolt up to. This bracket here is held on with T45s. And it's also part of the tensioner assembly. You get the crank bolt off. You can see the harmonic balancer. It's got a bit of rubber around here. This whole thing feels really light, so I'm going to say it's either a die cast or some magnesium alloy. Oh yeah, and look at this interesting pattern here that Audi has done on the crankshaft itself. You can imagine how long it took to machine that. And there's a little pin here that lines it up. Pulleys on the front here all have these little hubcaps. This is the tensioner for the AC compressor that sits here. You can see how the bolt is set in off center, and then you'd put a Torx in here to tighten up that belt. 10 triple square for this one. So similar to the alternator bracket on that side, there's a bracket here for the AC compressor. Alright, so underneath that engine mount we have this black chamber here that's got a vacuum line going to it. I'm going to remove this knock sensor. And this piece can come off. If you notice, metal is not brittle like plastic. Alright, here near the top of the engine where the oil filter would sit, there's a very interesting looking thermostat device. It's got a spring inside, but it sits in the oil just before the oil filter. It'll create quite a mess when I turn this engine over. And this is the oil cooler, which I'm going to leave on for now because of the mess. Alright, now I'm going to turn this engine over so we can work on the bottom end. There's the oil. If anybody can recommend me a larger oil pan that'll sap up all this stuff at once, so I don't have to keep borrowing my brother's old shirts to sap things up in my garage. On the bottom of this engine we have the lower oil pan, which looks like it's made of stamped aluminum. This here is the drain port if you want to do normal oil changes like me and don't have a fluid extractor. Here is the oil level sensor, and that's what's going to tell the dashboard that you're running low on oil. There's the level sensor. I wonder how this works, if there's a float inside or it's like a reed switch or something. Now I'm going to remove the oil pan. See, one thing with German cars, you don't have to deal with rusty fasteners or rusty oil pans. You never see an oil pan this clean on Honda, for example. They don't give you any pry points, which tells you they don't really want you to service this thing. And just like my aunt would say, if they don't give you pry points, you gotta make your own. And here's a look inside of the oil pan. As you can see, there's little metal flakes inside of here that make it look all silvery and shiny. That indicates maybe some bearing material went through here. Taking a look inside of this oil pan, we have a plastic pickup device that leads to a tube. The oil pump here is at the top and it's chain driven off the crankshaft. And then here we have the upper oil pan. So let's see if we can take this off. Pop that off. And looking inside there, I don't see any particles or any foreign material. I don't see any bearing material in there at least. Very interesting design for a pickup tube. Looks like this outside part here kind of functions like an anti-sloshing device to help the oil stay down near the bottom. Now I'm going to remove a couple hundred more T35 bolts that hold this upper oil pan onto the block. Oh yeah, by the way, none of these bolts are magnetic, so make sure you don't drop them inside the engine. Before I knock this off, I'm just going to wipe up all this oil before it makes a huge splash. Cotton t-shirts are the best for sopping up oil because they're very absorbent. Another piece. Thought we were going to be seeing the connecting rods. Alright, so at the bottom here looks like we got a windage tray that's made of aluminum, which is nice. Kind of holds the structure of the block together. So we're going to go ahead and remove all these T30s now. It appears that these two are like drain backs to bring the oil back down from the top of the engine. It's like there's another plastic baffle inside of here. If you look in here, the oil's supposed to settle and then go into those tiny slits inside of there to drain down to the bottom. So finally we can see the rotating assembly with the crankshaft and these connecting rods. And I'm very thankful that this timing cover at the back here doesn't have any dowels sticking in here, allowing me just to easily remove the upper oil pan and that bed plate. Let's turn my attention to the front cover here that houses the oil pump and the front crankshaft seal. Interesting, these are two oil galleys that they've punched through the block when they're doing the machining, and instead of putting caps on them when they're done, they've just used the front cover to cap them off. I don't like that because these are seals that could potentially leak the oil pressure inside of here. I'd rather if they've actually capped them off. So here's the timing chain setup at the front of the engine. Previous generations actually had an accessory drive rod that would run to the back of the engine where the actual timing chains are that go to the crankshaft. Let's remove this timing chain tensioner. As you can see, it's spring loaded. And let's get this one off. This one's metal, but it's got a plastic slide on it. And then I can shake the chain off. Let's get the pump off next. Next up, we're going to work on the connecting rods. Okay, I got to push some of these pistons out of here. Well, I gotta say I'm a little disappointed. I didn't see any bearing material or any spun bearings or damaged bearings when I was taking off the connecting rods. All of the coating looks on there perfect, with the exception of this one here, which I can't get this bolt off because it rounded. So we're gonna have to take this off the stand and grind it off. Now notice that there's no ladder frame design holding this together. Instead, it's actually cross bolted on the outside here with some triple square bolts. So we're gonna take these 10mm 12-point sockets off. Alright, now I'm going to remove these M10 triple squares that are cross bolted to the mains. And there's one hidden inside this pocket for the oil pump. No! As you back this out, the ratchet's going to get stuck. Should have made a pass through here or something. Alright, I need to get this motor off the stand. We got the rest of the engine block on the floor now. I removed all the timing chain bolts. There's the timing chain cover. I don't see any oil galleys running through it, which is a good thing. The reason why I couldn't spin this crankshaft over is because this chain was locking up on me. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the chain. As you can see, this timing chain setup is very intricate. We have a gear that's spinning this counter shaft, and then this counter shaft, which I believe is a balance shaft, spins the chains that goes to the camshaft. Okay, this piece broke off. Timing chain guides are pretty common on Audis, and you have to remove the engine because the transmission bolts up to here in order to replace that. Get this guide off. Now if you notice, these timing chain slides actually just fit on top of these pinions over here. There's no bolt holding that in. As a matter of fact, that's just a slider that we can remove like that. See if I can remove this counter gear. Remove these bolts here that hold the balance shaft cover on. Once again, it does look like this was a block-off plate for some oil galleys and a coolant galley that they've drilled into the block over here. So this connecting rod bolt is stripped out. I'm going to see if I can remove it using my bolt extractor. So I got this bolt to start coming out. There's what's left of the connecting rod bolt. And here's the connecting rod. I'll just push the piston down and out of the way. I'm trying to remove these main bearings, but it's not easy. There we go. Alrighty, I got the crankshaft out, finally. Main bearings all look good. Alright, the last little bit here is the oil cooler, which sits in the middle of the hot V. The seal broken here. You can take this off. So how this works is you got oil in, oil out, coolant in, and coolant out. Now the front of the block, there's a 16mm bolt that holds this counter shaft on. Alright, I broke it free with the breaker bar. I should be able to pop that balance shaft loose. Now this shaft does have to get timed, obviously, because it has to counter the vibration. So now we've finally torn this engine down to the block. Let's take a look at how the oil lubrication system works. Essentially, starting at the bottom of the engine, we have this very weird looking oil pickup tube. That's going to bring oil into the oil pump on the outside here, which was driven off of the crankshaft with that chain. Inside of this oil pump here, you can see this is the exit port that goes down into the block over here. But wait, there's more. This oil pump is a computer variable oil pump. We have a line here that goes down to the solenoid on the side of the block. Now that oil control switch has a little screen on it, and that's going to control oil pressure according to what the computer decides is most efficient for the vehicle. Let's quickly tear apart this oil pump. As I expected, it's a vane style oil pump. Oh my goodness, this is going to get all over my hands. So how this oil pump works is you can see we've got a large cavity on this side and a small cavity on this side. And this is in the default position, so it's going to give you maximum flow as it tries to squeeze a lot of liquid into a smaller area of liquid and then out the exit point, which is on this side here. Now in variable mode, that oil pressure is going to come in this side of the cavity here and compress that spring. And watch when I compress that spring, you can see that the cavity over on this side gets smaller and the cavity on this side gets larger. That means you're going to have less flow rate as this oil pump is moving. So when the computer decides that it's economically feasible to have low oil pressure, it's going to actuate that solenoid to close up the spring. And that's how you have a variable geometry oil pump. I'm going to sap up this oil. And I found a fresh t-shirt from my daughter's laundry, so I'm just going to use that to wipe up my hand. I'm using this wire here to help me identify which galley goes where, because there's so many integrated in this block. Essentially, oil from the pump is going to come through this galley from the bottom, past this oil pressure switch that lives over here, and goes straight to the top here where the oil filter lives. Now the oil filter here, if you remember, there was a spring regulator that sat inside of here to control oil flow. And if I trace my wires, that oil galley is then going to run over here to where that oil cooler sat on top of the block. Now the output of the oil cooler also goes to this hole over here that has the spring in it, so it's likely that this is actually a temperature controlled thermostat of some sort that allows the oil to be cooled off depending on temperature, or shorted out if it's a cold start. Moving along to the back of the block here, you can see there's two main oil galleys drilled across the length of the block, and this here is where your timing chain tensioners would sit. Now this oil galley tees off to go to each head respectively for their lubrication and variable valve timing system. And you'll also note that these oil galleys are blocked off by the timing chain cover that sat over here. Now the cooling system on the block is also a bit complex. Essentially we've got the water pump that sits at the front here and the thermostat housing. That's going to feed into this semi-closed block design. You can see they've got the reinforcements here, which is great for good power, but obviously not as good for cooling around the cylinder. And over on this side, we have that plastic radiator inlet that's very brittle and easy to break. Whereas on this side, they use metal, so I don't know what gives. Now, if you noted, the block actually uses a 90-degree V design, and that's typical of most Audi V6s. That's also reflected here in the crankshaft, the way these pins are situated offset from each other. You can even see they've drilled holes out to make this crankshaft a bit lighter, although it's pretty hefty and it's got good sized counterbalances on it. I do like that they are using a gear to drive the counter gear as opposed to another chain, but they did have to use a separate chain at the front for the oil pump. Now I gotta say, although the oil pan showed a little bit of paste, like bearing material, and it was kind of obvious that this piston may have kissed the head because it's so shiny and the carbon is blocked off from it, the bearings underneath actually looked in pretty good shape. They didn't look spun or damaged in any sense. Now the skirts on the outside on this bank specifically are pretty worn out, whereas the one on the other sides are not. Looking at the head here, you can see this surface here was also cleaned of carbon as the piston struck the head. Maybe something to do with the connecting rod stretching, because the bearings didn't seem like they were damaged. Most V6 engines use a twin turbocharged setup where we have the turbochargers on the outside of the V. In this case, Audi has made one large turbocharger for both heads, which means that they've integrated the exhaust manifold here to collect all the exhaust gases from these three cylinders into one port here, and then the turbocharger bolts up to here. Of course, on the other side, the same port feeds one large turbocharger that goes down the middle. Oil from the head is going to come to the top here and send along this oil galley that runs here to power these hydraulic lifters. Now these lifters are responsible for taking up any lash between the roller and the camshaft itself. I do like how they have this clip on the end here, because in some engines they don't have any clips and these could be detached and then the roller falls off into the head. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Pentastar V6. Also Subarus are known for this. Normally when you're driving along, this roller is going to be following the lower of the two cam profiles. Now this actuator here has these two nubs on it. That's going to sit inside of these grooves, and when you actuate it down, it's going to follow those grooves, which are going to force the cam profiles to click over into this mode, and now these rollers will be forced to follow the higher of the two cam profiles over here. Now I gotta say, this cam cover is very well over-engineered. You can see that they've taken out every little bit of material that they don't need for strength to make it a little bit lighter, and it's got to integrate things like your direct injection, spark plugs, and the variable valve lift actuators, as well as the vacuum pump and direct injection pump, among all of these sensors in one. This is a very complicated piece. Oh yeah, and as I've mentioned before, make sure you get these roller arms changed because they do disintegrate over time and could damage your engine. It is quite costly to replace because of the labor involved. Now if you remember, the cover that sat over here was nothing special, just a big bowl of soup. But what sits behind it is pretty cool. It looks like a trumpet. So I want to take out some of these valves here just to demonstrate how bad the carbon buildup is, because this is a direct injection engine. I'm just going to use this valve removal tool here. Ow! Ow! Here, let's try this again. I want to get the valve keepers off. It's so hard to get out. So as you can see, over the miles of this engine, the carbon has built up, and because you don't have port injection to have gasoline wash off this carbon, it's just going to keep building up due to the PCV system dumping more carbon into it, and you can see it's pretty caked under. Now having carbon on the valves is not good because it's going to start restricting your airflow inside, and your engine's going to run pretty poorly. Now in order to take care of this, you will have to do an induction service, which basically means to open it up, sandblast it with a soft material like walnut shells. But you will have to do this probably 2 times in the life of the vehicle, maybe 1 time depending on how long these Audis last. Look at all that carbon built up inside of here. You can see how it's eventually going to clog up the whole area. Now I know this engine's an Audi, you got all this foam here, you want to be all refined and you're trying to optimize weight for fuel economy, but where's all this plastic and foam going to end up? It's going to end up in the landfill. I mean, I'm going to put it right now in my garbage can. I mean, is this jacket thing even metal? Can I recycle this? And that's a look inside of the B9 S4's 3-liter turbocharged engine and how it works. I had a lot of fun tearing down this engine because it's a very different perspective on how Audi thinks an engine should be optimized and over-engineered and complicated for service. Make sure you subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one.